This week on the Talent Talks podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Procurement Director of Burberry, Ben Paynter. Ben is a procurement leader with 18 years of working in procurement across several FTSE 100 companies, as well as a role working for the government commercial function. The roles have all involved delivery change in brownfield organisations, as well as creating and maturing procurement within a greenfield environment. His career started in sales and proactively moved into procurement outside of this previous company. His own experience of moving career paths is why he's so passionate about bringing non-procurement professionals into the procurement world and true continuous improvement of individuals and functions. I hope you enjoy the episode. I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Paynter today of Burberry. Ben, good to have you on the show.
Martin. Good to see you.
And this is the second time we've done something a little bit like this on someone else's podcast. So
it is.
I know we know each other a fair amount of time now, but let's start off with how did you sort of get into procurement in the first place, Ben?
So I was working in sales originally, and I was dealing with procurement people, and I actually thought I really like the look of what they do. So aside from the commission and some of the benefits in working for sales, dealing with those people, seeing what they were, other organisations, I actually thought, I think this is something I'd quite like to do more than what I'm doing at the moment. So that sort of greater investment in the success of companies. I was still negotiating with my suppliers and stuff, so I actually realised I liked that side more. So I thought, actually, I can maybe do that. So I looked for a role proactively in procurement outside of what I was doing. Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate to find someone who was actually just looking for someone with commercial acumen, some market knowledge. So at the time I was looking at IT specifically. I was selling IT. So there's a guy called Stuart Rose. He's now at HSBC. And he took quite an open approach, which shaped, I think, a lot of my thinking about recruiting into procurement, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so he was looking for some just core attributes, some knowledge and stuff. He didn't mind that it didn't have procurement expertise. So I was very pleased to go into that. I was so keen to go into procurement. I actually took a fairly substantial drop between sort of my commission and my package because I just knew it's what I wanted to do. I was coming up to sort of my late 20s at the time. So it seemed like still quite a good time. I hadn't quite found my niche, but was really excited about that. So proactively moved across to procurement, and I have never looked back. Even within like month one or something, I knew I'd made the right choice.
So what was that hook then at the start? Because you're in a sales environment, talking to someone that's in sales, fast-paced, dynamic, good OTE, commission opportunities. Mm-hmm. What was the sort of, you said I knew I wanted to get into procurement. What was the hook then?
From speaking to procurement professionals. So every day, the people I was speaking to were procurement professionals. So sort of got to see the dynamics of what they did. As I said, I like the negotiating side of it. So sales, negotiating with customers, but also dealing with my suppliers, negotiating as well. So realised that I wanted some of that. Also, I think some of the brands and the opportunities, you've got more of an opportunity to be invested in it if you're working in that function rather than the sales side of stuff, because I could have looked at sales opportunities as well, different kind of companies. But I really, really wanted to do it. Absolutely loved it, was convinced and got the right choice. So I have a lot of thanks to someone that was willing to recruit a non-procurement person. It wasn't like an entry level, so it's a little bit higher than that. So it wasn't sort of starting off just doing admin. Yeah. Right from day one, I had the opportunity to engage with suppliers and do sort of strategic sourcing analysis. So a lot of stuff very similar to what I've been doing in the sales environment, but same lens. I think one of the things I found really advantageous as well is the fact I'd probably had much more extensive negotiating training than I think many procurement professionals will ever get.
You're in the cold face of it in sales.
Yeah. So I went on numerous negotiation courses. I had more than one company I worked at. They did different ones. I've done spin training. I've done other stuff, done account management training. And a long, long time ago back when I first finished uni, I also worked in customer services before I went off and did some backpacking, and got customer service training as well. So I had extensive customer service training. I think they're really useful skills that have helped me, I'd like to say flourish in procurement, but they're areas I think are often underinvested in procurement because people come in and it's like, these are all the procurement skills you need. Here's the training we can do. You can do SIPs and you might do some negotiation course. But I think the extensive stuff that I've had the other side is perhaps really helped me with what's quite a core part of my jobs.
Yeah. Well, isn't procurement sales anyway, ultimately? Selling to the businesses, selling to the needs. I mean, obviously, there's the commercial element of the contracts and supplier risk and all the other facets to it. But ultimately, at the core of it, wouldn't you say procurement is around selling to the business, selling to your suppliers, the needs?
Yes. So, I think that's a fair point. But there is. But I think most roles there's an element of selling, stroke pitching. So I think it depends on whether you're saying selling or pitching and the benefit of it. So, I think that's probably fair. So obviously you've got like your 5-minute elevator pitch that everyone tells you to try and work on, and also how you pitch your business to sales organizations, why you want to work with them, which sometimes is quite helpful, not always, because not all salespeople have, I think, the bigger picture view, because I think it can be quite a disconnect between the set incentives for a procurement organization when you're looking on behalf of your company and also a salesperson. There is a disconnect there where often the salespeople that you're negotiating will have a very short-term incentive in terms of that, because they don't know where they're going to be in the company in 1, 2, 3 years' time. Their personal commission, etc., is now. And then you've got a company like my organizations I've worked for, where for them, they're making strategic decisions. So there's often this massive disconnect with trying to get to that conclusion point, which when you're doing sort of negotiation stuff, it can be hard, because obviously win-win situation's great, but the disconnect between those two incentives can actually always cause a problem.
Yeah, no, totally. And I guess I first met you when you were over at ASOS, and so that sort of retail background. Obviously now at Burberry, I'm always fascinated to know in retail it's been tough. It's been well publicized. It's a difficult sector to work in, both now and in the last few years. How have you noticed the changes from peers you're talking to in other sectors, someone that maybe work in FS as a procurement leader versus retail? What are you seeing in retail right now? What are you seeing as maybe the differences in other sectors, in your day-to-day?
So the main thing is the fact that you're much more closely linked to a dynamic marketplace. So your forward view, your strategy within the department, the strategy of the businesses, it's linked to what consumers are doing. And there's such a huge variation in terms of that. So you have sort of feast and famine, boom and bust, that leads to you having to pivot a lot more in the retail environment than you would in other ones. So if I think to my roles at Regis and G4S, in those, you're doing B2B. So often you have a much longer pipeline, which supports your negotiation, well, not negotiation, but your contract lifespan, where you're looking at. So there's less of that need to be more dynamic. However, that sort of agility is very exciting, and that's what I didn't realize. So when I worked for the civil service for a bit, I didn't realize how much I actually thrived on that speed of change, that kind of thing, which is why I moved back into retail.
I was going to say, so on that point, because that's an incredibly diverse range of businesses that you're working in, Regis, co-working, spacing, G4S, I mean, they've got a plethora of under their sort of portfolio, public sector, obviously ASOS, Burberry. Did you consciously go back into retail because you maybe missed some of the pace? Is that fair to say with Burberry?
So when I was at the civil service, that's what I missed. And I didn't realise how much I thrived on that. So when I was in the ASOS role, that was like a big part of it, and saw fantastic opportunity, huge spend, maybe an opportunity to do something different as part of the lens in terms of the value you're providing to your customers, because in that scenario, your customers are taxpayers. So I was quite excited by that aspect of it. However, it's the first time I've worked properly in public sector. So at G4S, we did deal with the consequence of public sector procurement because they had a lot of government contracts. But yeah, once I was there, and actually I thought, I like the pace of this. I like how rapidly things change, the sort of long timelines. I found those an element of being sort of frustrating, and just some of the dynamics of the public sector procurement. So fantastic how it works, sort of like the intent of delivering best value, which I think sometimes it does a fantastic job of doing that, and the assurance and the governance around it, I think that's good. But I think at other times, sort of lower value stuff, I think the cost to procure can offset the guarantee of the value you're doing. So whilst you can guarantee you maybe got best commercial value, the cost of the procurement might offset some of that benefit that you would have got, as well as adding a delay into it. So that's what I love about retail, is that speed to do stuff.
Yeah. It's always been, when I first started recruiting, retail was always the market I naturally gravitated to. It's a fun space, a tough space. And as you say, that sort of B2C dynamic is ever changing. So in terms of some of the greatest challenges, and maybe, looking at the other way, the opportunities you're seeing in procurement more broadly at the moment as a profession, talk me through, what's the tough things that keep you up at night at the moment in terms of procurement on a wider level, not just sort of focusing on Burberry, but in the industry that you're seeing right now?
So I'll probably say one of the largest things that I have an area about, and we touched on this conversation offline and also on previous podcasts, is the need for skill sets related to ESG and CSR kind of stuff, because they're emerging marketplaces. They've got emerging regulation. There aren't people who are deep experts with how to apply it to the supply chain based on forthcoming things. So there's a big gap of skills there. And even sort of parts of business I deal with, my own business, and also when I speak to my peers, my networks, everyone wants someone who's fully formed, but it is not a mature enough area for that to do. And it's going to continue to evolve. So that's, I think, the most challenging part I've got. Also, ongoing thing in terms of availability of resource. Just when you go into the market, I think there's quite a disconnect often between it. So people either want someone who's fully formed or want someone very, very entry to sort of get them through that maturing process. And I don't think enough organisations willing to look at that middle tier. And as I say, like, I was very fortunate someone took me in above that basic level. And I think more organisations should look at that with those sort of other skill sets which can be harder to find. So commercial acumen, that's something that can be honed. I think there's different levels of capability people inherently have in that. But I think some of those other ones, it's harder to get that time to hone those skills or to even get them at all. Whereas a lot of procurement stuff, in terms of if you think of a very traditional approach, is very process driven, or it's very here's what to do. So you can teach people that, and you can teach people the theory behind it. Yeah. Not all workplaces you can apply that theory and stuff as well. So I think just there's general challenges there, and in terms of what the expectations are for people, what they're looking. And I just find it mad when you look at sort of job specs. Some of the things that are still consistently
need to have 10 years of category experience in X
category experiences. People referencing things like must have gone to Red Brick University, must have done this. So even if you're,
are you still? Yeah, still really.
Yeah,
wow.
Which I find perplexing.
I had that at the start of my career. I've not seen it as much. Yeah. I think there's an element of snobbery, if I can use that word, in some of the sort of big four and some of the consultancies and some of those bigger corporates. I think sometimes we see that need the red brick, but I know it's something you're very, as we've discussed already, about your kind of background and someone taking that sort of chance on you. But it's an interesting sort of paradox, because if you think about, you know, if you were to come to with an indirect services role, you would say, Martin, I don't care if they've worked in retail or if they've worked in financial services or whatever it may be. And yet there's peers of yours that are saying from a procurement skill set, they must have X. So if you could be agile on the industry sector where they're working in indirects, why does it matter if they've worked in lots of years in procurement, or if they worked in sales or commercial or...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's also something that I find bizarre, how many industries say they're looking for a category expertise, but yet they expect you to have industry experience, that industry, which I always find perplexing. You see it a lot with, say, aspects in banking, pharma and stuff. And I find that weird that they're cutting themselves off for a pool of talent as well. So that's always the thing I find hard, is when people are excluding prospective talent without speaking to them, without investigating them. For me, one of the things that I've always been really passionate to do as part of any recruiting is I try to keep it as competency focused. So anyone I speak to would normally do a soft interview, but actually the real part of the assessment for me is looking at doing a competency assessment that measures sort of their acumen, their thinking, what they can notice regarding stuff, sometimes a bit of contracts. I think that's key, because often that could be lost. I know from lots of people I speak to that they will hire on a standard interview process, but you've got no idea on the capability that someone's actually got all their true competency through speaking to them. You can only get to see that through witnessing. And whilst you may have the sort of probationary period, you don't really want to ever be using a probationary period to actually assess whether someone's good at their job. That should be for a different purpose. Whereas if you've done that competency piece, you should actually know that someone's going to be able to do it. So then you're using the probationary period for what it should really be used for, rather than actually using it to assess whether someone's actually any good.
So those sort of, that's an interesting point. And those sort of standardized competency questions that you would ask, or one would ask in general in an interview. So what kind of things, you've kind of touched on then, maybe looking at some of their sort of commercial acumen. What are the core things that you're saying, this person is the person I want on the team because of X, Y, and Z? Is there like a top 3 things, or what kind of must-haves? They've got to, you know, presumably they've got to have a good personality and be dynamic, but what sort of things are really important to you, Ben?
Good question. I wouldn't say I have a top 3, and it would depend on the individuals and the candidate. I try and avoid the concepts of just hiring like a mini-me or people similar. So I'll talk about the competency assessment. I actually do that as a case study. So it's a case study that gives like an example of a real life scenario. So it's even got comms linked to it. So this is how it comes and engages with you. this is what you've done, here's the proposal from the supplier, here's your thing. So I asked people to go through, do assessment of how they'd engage with the stakeholders, what they would do here, their feedback on it, their views, their perspective, how they would look to negotiate, any red line items. So it gives me a clear insight in their procurement capability.
So you've got something tangible there you might want to,
And I use it.
Them,
I've used one at all of my last roles. And actually, when I went to the civil services, one of the things that I think was the best thing I saw there was their recruitment process with their capability assessment. I was so impressed with that. And I think that's something that's really overlooked with doing that deep dive in terms of really understanding people's skills and making sure it's relevant to the job. Because
relevancy to the job is so important.
Because I've done things where they do numeracy tests and literacy tests, but things like the case studies really help you give an insight. And also when people are doing the playback to you, you start to get an understanding of their working patterns.
Yeah.
So whenever I do that, I'll also make sure that at the end of it, when someone joins a company, one of the first things to do with them is do a comprehensive playback with them on how they did in the case study, where there's opportunities for areas for development, where things were particularly strong. So that's part of it as well. And that can help me plan their training moving forward, or any areas that I think just experience or getting exposed to this stuff will help flesh out this area that you didn't come across so well in your case study.
Okay. Do you think there's such a thing as people over-interviewing? Are you seeing that in the market? Too many stages, too many processes around the kind of competencies that people are doing?
I've seen quite a lot where people talk about procurement processes, procurement recruitment processes taking too long. But at the same time, if you want to do good people and you want to assess them who've done it, it's going to take as long as it needs to take. And sometimes you might have multiple candidates and you've got to flex around their diary. So sometimes it can extend it, and you may have spoken to someone who is good, but you don't know until you've spoken to the other person. So I would certainly try and encourage people not to interview dozens and dozens of people and put dozens of people through any sort of process. You would hope that you get to a sensible position. So on that, I don't know. Feedback I've had from people is that individual companies they perhaps had a bad experience with, but I don't think there's an endemic problem where all companies are taking too long. And I would probably advise companies not to do that. Yes, if you meet someone, they're the ideal candidate, and you don't think you've got that benchmark of other people you've interviewed for other jobs, you might know from that and actually say, don't need to do more than this. But if you've got a new role or you're hiring at a level you haven't hired at before, if you've got that kind of stuff, then I think you should still make sure you've got a good, robust process. I think the important thing is setting expectations with candidates and being genuine about them, making sure that people understand what the process is they're going to go through, how long it's going to take. So I think that's a key thing, is often overlooked with setting that expectation of candidates where they don't hear back. I also think it's incredibly important to make sure you give comprehensive feedback to people. It's something that I think doesn't happen often. I speak to lots of candidates.
Not you're a no, you're not right.
Yeah, things like that. It's just
we can have a whole podcast episode on me talking about.
I find it very bizarre that that's the approach when you're asking people to give up a lot of their own time as well as part of it, and that you're not providing them purposeful feedback. So someone might not be fit for a role, but actually there could be another role out there, or you may have another role potentially in the future in your organisation that they could be good for. So it's just out of courtesy as well, providing people that feedback. If we want an industry to stay strong, be strong, people should be getting feedback about specific developmental opportunities, or maybe the reason why there's a disconnect, or unfortunately sometimes someone was just better. As disappointed as that is.
But I think people would value that. If I was interviewing with someone else and you turn around and say, "Look, Martin, they're just a better candidate. They've got more experience." Mm-hmm. If there was a second role, I think that authenticity in the approach of your feedback, I think people would value it rather than just the stock kind of answers. So I'll ask you a bit of a personal question, and not obviously to mention an individual's name, but is there anyone you've ever hired, or was there an example in your mind where you've maybe got an interview wrong? You've got something wrong. You've made the wrong hire. Please don't mention the businesses or the individual, but is there a time where you've maybe gone, I didn't get that right because I was hiring a mini me, which we see a lot. I've been guilty of that in the past, where I've had the unconscious bias of doing that. Have you?
I've probably been guilty of thinking that I just need capacity.
Yeah,
someone will do. Which I think is also not necessarily fair on them, because you're not setting them up for success. Yeah. So I've definitely done that before in the past, and that's something I now will make sure I never do. There's sort of a tolerance at the top end of the range where you think, actually, if it's within this, that's right. but it's not worth taking someone. It's not fair for you, the rest of the team. It's actually better to not have a person in role than just a bum on a seat. And I think that's a challenge that occurs. And I actually think that's a problem that happens that I think discredits a lot of people in the interim market, is people just go, just get anyone in, which I think then leads to a bad influence in terms of where they've just got someone who's available rather than waiting, or rather than do it. Because it's like, great thing about interims is there's always someone ready available. Well, I'm not sure that's quite the right thing. I think one of the great things with interims is the other side of what they do, and great interims are normally in roles.
Yeah,
so
of course.
waiting for people. And I think that can set a precedence with other parts of procurement. It can set a precedence in the business that actually the interim things you don't want to go to, where actually there is a time and a place for that as well.
Yeah, no, totally. I think if it's something that's a problem solving or looking at a niche sort of skill set or a transformation, but I guess the caveat of that is when they're not going to be culturally embedded into what you're creating in your permanent resources. There's often a fine balance, as I'm sure sort of you've experienced. So in terms of interviewing a profile, if we sort of rewind from Ben 10 years ago, when you were first sort of in a leadership role and you were hiring versus today, how's that changed for the person that you're looking for?
Well, I've learned some lessons, like I said, about not hiring someone. I've refined some of my processes as well in terms of doing things like the case study. I think I've changed to make sure I'm never considering the concept of cultural fit. Previous organisations of that. Certainly that was a concept in terms of cultural fit, but I think that leads to you perhaps not hiring the best candidate in terms of the role itself. I also think it could probably lead to bias, both conscious and unconscious, which I don't think is very fair either. So definitely I don't try to look at that cultural fit side of stuff. I think there's a different lens to that rather than cultural fit, but actually someone's ability to flourish in the nature of the industry. So retail, which is really fast paced, certainly, I think you need to be clear to someone if they're coming from a different kind of organisation, so something much longer standing or public sector, that there is a huge difference between the demands on you, your ability to plan, the ability to need to be reactive, how sometimes everything doesn't have to be A+ grade. Sometimes the need to do it means that B- etc. is suitable quality, just because actually it's about reacting to the speed of the business. So making sure you deliver sooner can be better than later. So I think setting that expectation with candidates is clear. I try to make sure I do that. The other thing that I now do is I make sure people have a lot more time to interview me. So do reverse interview. So when I do an interview, if it's say an hour to an hour and a half long, I'll make sure a candidate has at least 25 minutes, 30 minutes to ask me anything they want, whether that's about me personally, whether it's about the function, whether it's about the organisation, whatever it is. I want to make sure people can do that open opportunity, because it is a two-way thing. People should be wanting to choose there. I often think that people who are recruiting say, well, it's up to us, we're choosing it and we're doing it.
It's a two-way process.
And it really is. And I don't think that people afford that. And likewise about setting people up for success, I would rather, if I was going to offer to someone and I offered and they said, actually, based on, this things, I don't think it's the right thing for me. Again, I'd rather someone was joining who's in the right mindset, feels set up for success and is in that good space.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And in terms of the profile of procurement person, how have you seen that change from today versus probably where you were at the start of your career? Is there a noticeable difference in terms of caliber, or in terms of the experience that you're seeing? Anything you're sort of noticing?
So I'd probably say not. And I think the difference is the nature of the markets that people are buying. So all of them have evolved and changed. So actually the marketplace knowledge, so whether that's in technology, whether it's in sort of other areas that are perhaps a bit more dynamic, but there's always change. So the skill sets or the nature of services that people have been buying, I think that's sometimes where generalists can struggle a little bit, where someone's looking for a deep subject matter expert, and they'll say, I use IT because that's my deep knowledge. And they'll say, well, I did some IT stuff back 8 years ago. That is a very different thing to now. So the relative, I think it's the relativity of deep subject matter expert. I think it's the one thing that can be hard. And I'd say certainly people that are more generalists have a wide range to make sure they keep moving things. So an area of knowledge doesn't become stale. So when they're saying I've done things when it's 5, 8, 10 years ago, because I think if someone said that to me when I was looking for a role or a particular project, or if I was looking at an interim and I wanted a very particular skill set, I think that would lead me to probably be concerned about their knowledge of the marketplace and the relativity, particularly if you genuinely do need someone to hit the floor running because perhaps you've got a niche project or you've got something that's specific you need them to focus on.
Yeah, no, agreed. And the relevancy, and that all goes back to the relevancy of the questioning you're asking them and the relevancy of the, totally agree. And in terms, and this is something, again, I know is passionate of yours before I even asked this question, the war on talent, the challenge of finding procurement people, the gap in the market. Why is that?
Well, why is it that everyone's always been saying that for 15 years?
But it's a rhetoric that goes round and round and round around, it's hard to find talent. There's not enough people. There's not enough good candidates.
So few things in that space. Procurement.
You can help me then get some.
Procurement is typically underinvested in, and often people aren't really taken on that cradle to the grave process where they set it in. I talked to you before about competency frameworks. It's something that I'm really passionate about, mapping every role to breakdown of skill sets and then subsets under that so that you can assess people, you show them where they need to be. So it really helps it, because job specs often will look no different. You just cross out the title. It looks the same for whatever it is. So for me, making sure that you're looking at that so you can really develop them, coming back to the point about hiring people into procurement who don't have a procurement background, that's another thing, bring more candidates in. So I think that sort of lack of investment going through that, also people not being open-minded to bringing people in. So I think they're sort of the challenges. I know people regularly without procurement, but there's a lot of people that I deal with who have fallen into procurement and then they are now a procurement professional. There's very few people.
They stay in it, don't they? I mean, I think that's the interesting thing with procurement. I say this all the time on the podcast. Like, people are, like they went, I'm going to start in sales or whatever the background may be. They go into procurement and they don't tend to leave. I mean, I don't tend to see people migrate away from it.
That could also be part of the challenge, though, in terms of that progression or developmental stuff. The fact that there's not high
in the leadership,
there's not things, and leadership often functions are very lean as well. So that could be part of the problem that's self-fulfilling, where it's a lean function that you don't even necessarily have the space to help support, grow people through it. And that's probably, most organizations have had that bit, and they've gone through phases where pressures have meant that you can't necessarily grow the team, even though they have a very tangible ROI. If you speak to any procurement person, they'll say about their frustration of actually having a number that delivers back to the bottom line. They might work in organizations that have got salespeople and they're infuriated that they're delivering a number that means a salesperson would have to do 10 times that to get the same benefit back to the P&L, yet is remunerated much more handsomely. So I know from speaking to procurement professionals, my own experience of that as well is definitely the case, that delta between sales and perhaps procurement, where you can have a huge impact on P&L, like straight back to P&L, no cost of sales and stuff. So I do get why procurement professionals are often frustrated with not having a team that's perhaps the right size to deal with it and set up for that. Also, I think a lot of organizations will do a very deep category focus in terms of it. So all categories may be treated equal from a capacity point of view, which is perhaps not always ideal because they've got different levels of complexity, different sizes of spend. So while sometimes the size of the spend is irrelevant because you still might have 100 suppliers, 100 contracts, they're just double the size, 3 times the size, but exactly the same. That's not always the case. And I don't think that a lot of functions perhaps put that real depth of thought into how a team is structured to deal with the volume of work and also where you can deliver the benefit as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was chatting to a CPO the other day and they were saying, and in fact, not the first person that's mentioned to me around how wouldn't it be great, more than great, wouldn't it get more engagement with the procurement community if actually bonuses were geared to the bottom line and what they were delivering back to the business? Don't know what your standpoint on that would be, but that ROI that procurement offer, let's look at a category manager that's on 50, 60, 70K and they're making a 3-4 million cost saving in a financial year. I mean, that's a huge return.
Cost saving via avoidance or back to P&L.
Sorry, let's go back to P&L. But in terms of that bottom line, what they're bringing in, what they're delivering to the business.
So there are lots of other benefits that procurement do. And I do think a lot of companies, so even though I've just referenced it, I'm about to say something, not flies in the face of what I said, but in the current climate, when inflation is as high as it is, actually, it's a win to keep costs flat, or it can be with some stuff. So if you move to that model where you're incentivizing things, you could lead to people doing bad procurement. And that's the other thing that I'd have a real concern about. And there's organizations.
When you say bad, just pick up on that. When you say bad procurement, in the sense of what?
Bad,
focusing on cost savings.
Yeah, bad
purely,
value over lifetime, which might mean that you can.
Short-term win, long-term. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so you'd want everyone to make sure they're doing what's best for the company for the time of that, the period and stuff. And I think the incentives thing, I talked a little bit earlier about salespeople. If incentives are geared incorrectly, it can lead to behaviour that's not the intent of what the incentive was put in place for, particularly when there's other things that are as important. So getting that thing to make sure that people are looking at the whole of value also is different for different categories as well. Some categories are sort of fixed costs that annualise, come back up to things.
That's
and other
true.
things are focused on new spend, focused on CapEx. So you can't do one for all. So there is always a challenge there with that incentivisation stuff as well. But as with any job, whether it's procurement, I think everyone who's delivering value back to a company should be paid appropriately for the value that they're delivering, as long as it's recognisable, the value that people are delivering. I think that's the key thing for any job is you need to make sure it's tangible. You can see the benefit that they're providing to your company. Yeah,
no, I agree. And I think there's also perhaps a level of impatience perhaps with those sort of buyers and procurement managers. They want to get to head of. And, you had to sort of earn your crust and work your way up and have years of commitment and dedication to get to the level you're at now. Whereas I'm seeing with, maybe it's a generational thing, I don't know, a lot of people that start in their careers after university or whatever, and they go into procurement by whatever means, they almost bypass a couple of levels of grading quite quickly. And then they're going into head of procurement level roles. It's not an age thing, but if only a few years into their career, then they're getting very frustrated that they can't get, and then you've got a real saturation point at procurement director level, and the kind of level you're operating at, and there's not enough people below it. I don't know whether you've seen that, but that's something that I've, or if there's any rhyme or reason why that's the case, if it's impatience because of the business not valuing procurement, going back to your earlier point, I don't know, but I think that's the challenge. My view is, we're aligned on your opinion around, focusing on not just on you've got to have X years of experience in procurement. You're a great case point of going from sales into commercial, into procurement, and then onwards and upwards. I think more businesses and more people need to have that agility of approach and thought. But I also think that, there's not enough from universities, from colleges. I think the SIPs, maybe talk about that a little bit. I think the governing body for procurement, they need to be doing more to be that professional. I used it at an event the other week talking about the profession of choice. I don't know if procurement is a profession of choice. Most people fall into it and they retain in it when they're in it, they love it like you are. But is it a profession of choice right now?
I have interviewed very few candidates who have done a degree that's relevant to getting into that position. Most people I've interviewed will be mid-20s and might have already touched a role elsewhere or become aware of procurement through being in an organisation. I don't really know how you do that, to be quite frank. It is definitely a thing. It doesn't sound sexy. Like, I still have to explain what procurement is to loads of people when I say, what do you do?
Yeah.
And they're like,
my wife's still not sure how.
It's amazing how often then you sort of explain about the responsibility for spending money, value, and all of the kind of good things that you get involved in, intercompany thing, like strategic projects. And then think, that sounds really interesting. So I do think that people don't do enough of that. I also think that my experience of speaking to a lot of graduates, and I depressingly have nephews and nieces who are post-university age now, but they will talk about the trade fairs and stuff where people will come along. There's a lot of big companies with a lot of money that are nothing to do with procurement who go in and just want to take all these bright people. So you see it a lot with sort of consultancies, management firms. They'll go in, they cherry pick all these great people who will then come back and get exposure to procurement via those organisations. And actually, I've seen people move into them. Some of those companies do have procurement arms that provide support and stuff. They invest in them well. They do that. I think there was an industry where people want to do it. I think aside from huge manufacturing thing, which I think is often the lens, I think it's probably more mature on the direct side stuff.
Yeah. Well, you look at like JLR and BA and some of those brilliant grad schemes that have some fantastic procurement people and supply chain.
So I think from, and that's anecdotal because I haven't worked on that side of it, but my impression is from that, and people I know who've done graduate schemes, normally the bit they've done is on the direct side of stuff rather than it being indirects. And I was taking a very indirects heavy lens here because that's what I look after and that's what I've always been in parts of. But that is definitely underinvested. And I think unless you're really interested in the product. I think it's a sexier part of procurement to work in.
Quick break from the episode. Hope you're enjoying today's show. To keep up to date with our Talent Talks podcast episodes, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. This will help build our audience and our mission to raise the profile of procurement. I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Do you think the onus is on the procurement? I mean, I've talked around like SIPs could do maybe more, the education sector could do more, the government maybe could do more. Do you think it's also on you guys in the procurement space?
I think it's on everyone.
Yeah.
I think I think that everyone should do more. Like, it's one of the reasons why I've started trying to make a bit more of effort doing things like this. So got to a reflection point about 6-12 months ago, and I've probably...
What prompted that reflection point then?
Just an anniversary in a role. So I try and do things at New Year. I'll do a reflection, look backwards on the year as a whole, which will include a little segment of career. But because it was a job anniversary, it led to me actually specifically thinking about my job, my career and stuff. And I suddenly realised that actually I do love procurement, I genuinely do, but I don't do enough on the procurement external stuff. So, and I probably don't invest in myself enough on the procurement external stuff. So it's one of the things I made a real concerted effort that I actually want to do more about. So I do love it. I do think it's a great career, but I think everyone has, I think companies have responsibilities, but they don't have responsibility just for procurement. They should do it for all of those areas that perhaps it's more challenging to get people into or are less well known. SIP certainly, I think, could be doing a lot more in terms of itself as an organisation to make sure it's a sexy career. I don't know a huge amount about what they do. I certainly don't see enough of the visibility there if they do it, but it's like how we can all elevate, how we can do it. So I think everyone who works in procurement who's passionate about it should be doing that. So if you want to keep it as a career, you want to keep it, and you also want to keep getting good talent through, making sure that you've got the best you can be. So I think without that could be some of the challenges you get back into your business is where the perception of procurement is not great because you not every single one in a team can be maybe this amazing thing. And also different people, they require nurturing and fostering to be the best they can do. So sometimes when you work with different people in your team, you might say, well, this is how we're going to work for them. But actually you might realize taking them through that development path that actually I think I need to do a different style with them. It's like the man management thing for a football team. Different people require different stuff to get the best out of them. I think when you're a lean function, you're underinvested, I think it can be quite hard to have a flex of different styles with the different people within your team in terms of their coaching, their developing, their mentoring, making sure they're getting exposures elsewhere. And I think that's another good thing companies can do more of is making sure that you do things. Perhaps the other one is I've heard of before, but I don't think it's that common. It's common into procurement from other parts of the business where I've hired people from other parts of my businesses I've worked in because they got a skill set, but they're moving into a perm role, whereas I think that opportunity for rotation. So maybe changing grad programs, because some grad programs are pretty good, but some
get the rotation into procurement.
Rotation into procurement or sort of commercial parts of the organisation.
Because it touches everything, right? Procurement is everything. It's the sales, it's the marketing, it's the tech, it's the supplier risk management, it's the contract management, it's working with legal, it's every facet of a business procurement touches. So it just seems like a huge open goal there to be able to do more. And Ben, we could talk about this for hours. Thank you so much for joining me.
No worries.
It's really nice to catch up with you.
You too.
And especially down the road for here in Dorset. So thank you for coming down to see me, and I look forward to watching the journey develop and evolve.
Great. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Ben.
Cheers.
I hope you enjoyed today's show, and we'll be back soon with more Talent Talks podcasts. In the meantime, please hit the subscribe button on your favourite platform. See you soon. Take care.